My name is Arthur Hastings, and for the past 18 months, I have served as the nocturnal custodian of silence and order at the Oak Haven Town Library. The official job title, printed neatly on my ID badge, reads Night Security Officer, a designation that always felt a touch grandiose for what the role typically entails. Mostly, it's about walking the echoing halls, ensuring the only spirits present are those bound in leather and ink, and that the grand old building itself settles into its nightly slumber without incident. Oak Haven Library is a relic of a more generous civic age, a Carnegie building gifted to the town in 1908. It's a beautiful, if somewhat somber, edifice of stone and dark wood, with high, vaulted ceilings in the main reading room and narrow, labyrinthine stacks that seem to absorb sound and light in equal measure. My shift begins at 10 per hours p.m., just as Mrs. Gable, the head librarian, and a woman whose stern demeanor belies a surprising fondness for romance novels, locks up. We exchange a few pleasantries. The weather, the quietude of the day, perhaps a gentle complaint about a misshelved book that caused her undue consternation. Then she's gone, her sensible heels clicking away into the evening, and I am left with the vast, hushed expanse of the library. The first hour is always the same, a thorough patrol, a checklist in hand, main entrance, double locked, windows secured, emergency exits clear. The children's section, with its brightly colored murals and miniature chairs, always feels a little too cheerful in the dim emergency lighting, like a birthday party abruptly abandoned. Then, through the hushed aisles of fiction, past the biographies staring silently from their shelves, and into the non-fiction wing, where history and science rest in ordered rows. The local history archive, a small, climate-controlled room in the basement, is always the last stop on this initial circuit. It's a place I tend to linger in the least. The air is unnaturally cold, and the scent of aging paper and something else, something vaguely metallic and unsettling, is stronger there. Once the perimeter is secure, the night truly begins. It's a slow, methodical passage of hours, marked by the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the main hall, a sound so constant it becomes a part of the silence itself. I have a small office near the front desk, equipped with a comfortable chair, a perpetually lukewarm coffee machine, and a bank of CCTV monitors that display grainy, monochrome images of the library's key areas. For the most part, these screens show nothing but empty rooms and silent corridors. I read, mostly. It seems fitting, surrounded by so many untold stories, to lose myself in one of my own choosing. Sometimes I study, working on a slow-burn online degree in history, a pursuit that feels both ironic and appropriate given my surroundings. The library, at night, has its own unique soundscape. The hum of the ancient heating system, the occasional creak of settling timbers, the sigh of wind against the tall, arched windows. These are the familiar noises, the ones that offer a strange sort of comfort in the otherwise profound stillness. For the first year, these were the only sounds. The job was predictable, almost meditative in its monotony, a sanctuary from the noise of the world. It was about 6 months ago that things began to shift, subtly at first. So subtly, in fact, that I dismissed them as products of an overactive imagination or the simple fatigue that comes with a reversed sleep schedule. The first incident I recall with clarity involved a book in the philosophy section. I was doing my 2-hour AM patrol, flashlight beam cutting a swathe through the darkness, when I noticed it, a slim volume of Plato's Republic, lying flat on the floor, spine upwards, as if it had been deliberately placed there. I frowned. Patrons weren't allowed in at this hour, and Mrs. Gable was meticulous about end-of-day tidying. I picked it up, checked for damage, and slotted it back into its correct place between Aristotle and Socrates. An oversight, I told myself. Someone must have dropped it earlier, and it had gone unnoticed. A week later, it was a chair in the children's section, one of the small, brightly painted wooden chairs, pulled away from its table and facing the wall, as if a very shy child had been having a time out. Again, I rationalized. Perhaps the evening cleaning crew, though they were usually long gone before my shift even started, had moved it and forgotten to put it back. My mind, it seemed, was adept at finding mundane explanations. It wanted them. Then came the whispers, or what I initially thought were whispers. It started in the biography section, a part of the library that always felt particularly crowded, the weight of so many lives pressed together. It was a faint, sibilant sound, like dry leaves skittering across pavement, or air escaping a punctured tire, too soft to be distinct, too fleeting to be certain. The wind, I'd tell myself, playing tricks with the old window casements, or mice, though I'd never seen any droppings. The sounds were always at the edge of hearing, vanishing the moment I tried to focus on them. The cold spots were next, not the consistent chill of the archives, but isolated pockets of unnatural cold that would bloom and fade in random locations. One moment, I'd be walking down an aisle, the air still and temperate. The next, I'd pass through a patch so frigid it would raise goose flesh on my arms, only for it to be gone a few steps later. I checked for drafts, for open vents, for any logical source. There was never one. I started to feel it then, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the distinct, unnerving feeling of being watched. It was strongest in the older sections, particularly the narrow aisles of the pre-1900s fiction collection. where the books were bound in dark, somber colors, and the light seemed to struggle for purchase. I'd spin around, flashlight beam stabbing into the shadows, expecting to see, well, I didn't know what I expected to see. There was never anything there. Just rows upon rows of silent books, watching. Still, I clung to logic. The building was old. Old buildings made noises. I was often tired. Tiredness played tricks on the senses. The power of suggestion was strong. Once you started looking for the unusual, you were bound to find it. I even mentioned very casually to Mrs. Gable one morning if she'd ever noticed any odd drafts or sounds. She'd given me a sharp look over her spectacles. "Arthur," she'd said, her voice crisp, "this library has stood for over a century. It has its quirks, like any old dowager. Pay them no mind." And so, I tried, but the incidents, though minor, began to form a pattern, a quiet accumulation of wrongness. The misplaced books became more frequent, sometimes appearing in sections they had no business being in. A cookbook in the poetry aisle, a travel guide atop the periodicals. The faint sounds grew a fraction louder. The cold spots lingered a moment longer. My rationalizations started to feel thin, worn through like the threadbare carpet in the reference section. The event that truly began to erode my carefully constructed skepticism occurred about 2 months ago. It was a Tuesday, or perhaps a Wednesday. The nights blur together. I was in my office, reviewing the CCTV footage from the previous hour, a habit I developed more out of boredom than necessity. The camera in the main reading room, a wide-angle shot covering the expansive space, showed nothing unusual. Empty tables, silent chairs, the grandfather clock marking time. I fast-forwarded, then paused. Something had caught my eye. I rewound the footage slowly. There, on one of the large oak reading tables in the center of the room, a heavy dictionary lay open. I knew for a fact that all books were cleared from the tables at closing. I watched, my breath catching in my throat. The timestamp in the corner of the screen read 3:17 a.m. Nothing happened for a long moment. Then, with no discernible human interaction, no flicker of movement elsewhere in the frame, the pages of the dictionary began to turn. Slowly, deliberately, one after another, as if an unseen hand were leafing through them. They turned for perhaps a minute, then stopped, resting on a particular page. I stared at the monitor, my heart thudding against my ribs. I played it back again and again. There was no glitch, no trick of the light. The pages moved. I got up, my legs feeling unsteady, and walked out to the main reading room. The air was still, the silence absolute, except for the clock. The dictionary was there, on the table, open. I approached it cautiously. It was open to the entry for silence. That was the first time I felt a genuine sliver of fear, cold and sharp, not just unease or curiosity, but a primal sense that something here, in the quiet, ordered sanctuary of the Oak Haven Town Library, was terribly, inexplicably wrong, and it was only just beginning to show its face. The image of those dictionary pages turning, unbidden, under the cold gaze of the CCTV camera replayed in my mind for days. Silence. It felt less like a random word and more like a command or perhaps a statement of intent. My carefully constructed walls of rationalization, already weakened by the preceding months of subtle oddities, had developed a significant breach. Fear, once a fleeting visitor, now felt like a permanent resident in the quiet corners of my thoughts. I began to document everything in a small, spiral-bound notebook I kept locked in my office desk. I started logging every misplaced book, every inexplicable sound, every cold spot, noting the time, location, and nature of the occurrence. My entries, initially sparse, began to fill the pages with an alarming regularity. The phenomena, as if sensing my heightened awareness, seemed to shed some of their previous coyness. The misplaced books were no longer just in the wrong sections. They were often left in conspicuous places, sometimes open to specific pages. A copy of Poe's The Raven was found splayed on the main circulation desk, open to the stanza where the narrator questions the bird. A heavy art book, one I knew required considerable effort to move, appeared balanced precariously on the edge of a high shelf in the biography section, as if daring gravity. I'd return them, my hands sometimes trembling slightly, the simple act of reshelving feeling like a small act of defiance against an unseen, mischievous force. The whispers changed too. They were still faint, still at the periphery of my hearing, but they began to carry a cadence that was disturbingly close to language. I couldn't make out words, not clearly, but the rise and fall, the sibilant hisses and soft guttural clicks, sometimes sounded like a hushed, urgent conversation happening just out of sight or just beyond the veil of normal perception. These were most prominent in the older fiction stacks, where the narrow aisles and towering shelves created an oppressive, almost claustrophobic atmosphere. I'd find myself pausing, straining to listen, my flashlight beam cutting nervous arcs through the darkness, only for the sounds to recede as if aware of my attention. The cold spots became more intense, more defined. One evening, while patrolling the periodical section, I walked into an area so frigid it was like stepping into a walk-in freezer. The temperature drop was instantaneous and shocking. My breath plumed in front of me, and the hairs on my arms stood erect. I could feel the cold seeping into my clothes, chilling me to the bone. It wasn't a draft. The air was perfectly still, heavy with an unnatural iciness. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering. When I dared to reach a hand back into that space a moment later, the chill was gone. The air returned to its normal, ambient temperature. My notebook entry for that night was written in a shaky hand. My sanctuary, the small office with its CCTV monitors, began to feel less secure. The screens, which had once offered a sense of detached observation, now sometimes seemed to display things I couldn't reconcile. A flicker of movement in an empty corridor, too quick to be certain. A shadow in the corner of the children's section that seemed to deepen and lengthen when my back was turned. One night, the monitor for the local history archive went to static for a full 10 minutes. When the picture returned, a single leather-bound ledger, one I knew was kept flat on a reading table, was standing upright, perfectly balanced on its spine. The archive room itself had always been the most unsettling part of the library, but my unease now bordered on dread. The metallic scent I'd always noticed seemed stronger, mingled with something else, a faint, cloying sweetness like overripe fruit. I had to force myself to include it in my patrols. Each time I opened that heavy door, the wave of cold air that greeted me felt more personal, more unwelcoming. It was during one such reluctant visit to the archive, about 3 weeks after the dictionary incident, that I found something that deepened the mystery considerably. Tucked away on a low shelf, almost hidden behind a row of dusty town ledgers, was a small, unassuming wooden box. It wasn't cataloged. There was no label, no identifying marks. Curiosity, perhaps a foolish brand of it, overcame my apprehension. I pulled it out. It was surprisingly heavy for its size. Back in the relative safety of my office, I opened it. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, was an old daguerreotype photograph. It depicted a stern-faced woman in Victorian attire, her hair pulled back severely, her eyes dark and piercing. There was an intensity in her gaze that was unsettling, even in the faded image. Beneath the photograph was a small, tarnished silver locket and a lock of what appeared to be children's hair, tied with a faded blue ribbon. There were no names, no dates, just these silent, enigmatic objects. I felt a profound sense of sadness and a prickle of something akin to trespass. I returned the box to its hiding place the next morning, but the image of the woman's eyes stayed with me. The feeling of being watched was now a constant companion. It was a palpable pressure, like unseen eyes boring into my back. I started talking to myself, soft reassurances, fragments of songs, anything to break the oppressive silence and the feeling of scrutiny. Sleep became a luxury I could rarely afford. Even at home, during the day, I felt restless, on edge. The lines between the library's night and my day began to blur. My online coursework suffered. Concentration was a battle I frequently lost. Mrs. Gable must have noticed the change in me. One morning, as I was preparing to leave, she paused, her usual briskness softened by a hint of concern. "Arthur," she said, her gaze surprisingly gentle, "are you quite all right? You look tired." I forced a smile. "Just a bit, Mrs. Gable. The night shift can play tricks on your sleep schedule, you know." She nodded slowly, though her eyes lingered on me for a moment longer than usual. "Indeed. Well, see that you get your rest. An old building like this needs a sharp mind watching over it." Her words, meant to be reassuring, sent a small shiver down my spine. A sharp mind. Was mine still sharp? Or was it slowly unraveling, frayed by isolation and the inexplicable, the culmination of this period of escalating unease, the event that shattered any lingering hope of a rational explanation, happened on a rain-lashed Thursday night. The storm had been raging for hours, wind howling around the eaves of the library like a tormented spirit, rain beating against the tall windows in furious gusts. The power had flickered twice, and I was on edge, half expecting a full outage. I was in the main reading room, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the gloom, the emergency lights casting long, dancing shadows. The grandfather clock chimed 3 a.m., its resonant tones barely audible above the tempest. As the last chime faded, I heard it. Not a whisper this time, not a rustle or a creak. A sound, a distinct, clear sound from the far end of the reading room, near the oversized atlas stand. It was the soft, unmistakable sound of a child humming a nursery rhyme. My blood ran cold. Every nerve in my body screamed. I froze, flashlight beam fixed on the atlas stand. The humming continued for a few seconds, a simple, innocent tune that was rendered utterly terrifying by its context. It was a melody I vaguely recognized, one my grandmother used to hum. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Silence descended again, broken only by the storm and the frantic thumping of my own heart. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, rooted to the spot, my knuckles white on the flashlight. Slowly, forcing my legs to move, I walked towards the atlas stand. The massive book lay closed. The chairs were empty. There was nothing. No child. No source for the sound. But I had heard it. I was certain of it. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't my imagination. It was real. I backed away, never taking my eyes off the spot where the sound had originated. Back in my office, I didn't even bother to log it. What was the point? This went beyond misplaced books or cold spots. This was something else. Something that could mimic, that could perhaps remember. The rest of that night passed in a blur of heightened anxiety. Every shadow seemed to writhe. Every creak of the old building sounded like a footstep. When Mrs. Gable arrived at 7:00 a.m., her cheerful, "Good morning, Arthur," made me jump. I mumbled a response, my mind still reeling. As I walked out into the gray, rain-swept morning, the innocent tune echoed in my ears. The library was no longer just a building with quirks. It was a place with a presence, and that presence, I was beginning to fear, was aware of me, and it was drawing closer. The child's humming echoed in the recesses of my mind. For days, a phantom melody that surfaced at the quietest moments, overlaying the mundane sounds of my daytime existence with a chilling counterpoint. Sleep, already a fickle friend, became a battleground. When I did manage to drift off, my dreams were of endless, shadowy library aisles, of books with blank pages, and of a small, unseen child, perpetually just out of sight, humming that same innocent, terrifying tune. My reflection in the morning mirror showed a stranger, hollow-eyed, pale, with a nervous tension etched around my mouth. Arthur Hastings, night security officer, was beginning to look like a character from one of the Gothic novels he was supposed to be guarding. My meticulously kept logbook, once a source of some grim satisfaction in its orderly recording of the inexplicable, now felt like a testament to my own unraveling. The entries became more frequent, the handwriting more erratic. 0217, Children's Section. Sound of a single marble dropping and rolling. No marble found. 0340, History Stacks. Distinct scent of lavender. Very strong, then gone. Mrs. Gable doesn't use lavender. 0455, Main Reading Room. All chairs at the north-facing table turned to face the grandfather clock. I had checked them an hour prior. They were aligned. These were interspersed with more desperate personal notes. Heard the humming again, softer this time, from the direction of the biography section. Am I losing my mind? The library itself seemed to be watching me with a newfound intensity. The feeling of being observed was no longer confined to specific sections. It was pervasive, a constant pressure against my senses. The silence, once a comfort, now felt charged, pregnant with unspoken threats. I found myself jumping at the slightest creak of the ancient building, my flashlight beam darting into corners, expecting, I still didn't know what. But the expectation was a heavy weight. The phenomena escalated, moving from the subtly unsettling to the overtly strange. One night, while patrolling the fiction aisles, I heard a distinct rustling from a few rows over, not the dry leaf whisper of before, but a more substantial sound, like fabric moving, or pages being turned with deliberate slowness. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the vast space. "Is anyone there?" Only the oppressive silence answered, yet the feeling of a nearby presence was undeniable. I moved towards the source of the sound, my heart thudding a nervous rhythm against my ribs. As I rounded the corner of a towering bookshelf, I saw it, a single book, Great Expectations, lay on the floor open, and on the page, a sentence was underlined in what looked like fresh, dark ink. Ask no questions, and you'll be told no lies. My blood ran cold. I hadn't seen that book on the floor moments before, and the ink, it looked wet. I touched a hesitant finger to it. It smudged. I backed away, a knot of ice forming in my stomach. This wasn't a misplaced book. This was a message. The implications were terrifying. It implied intelligence, awareness, and a desire to communicate, however obliquely and menacingly. My visits to the archive room became exercises in pure dread. The cold in there was a constant, biting presence, and the metallic, sweetish odor seemed to cling to the back of my throat. The daguerreotype of the stern-faced woman and the small wooden box haunted my thoughts. I felt an irrational pull towards it, a need to understand its connection, if any, to the escalating strangeness. One night, stealing my nerves, I retrieved the box again. Under the dim light of my office, I examined the contents more closely. The silver locket was tarnished almost black with age. I managed to pry it open. Inside, on one side, was a miniature portrait, so faded it was almost invisible, of a young girl with wide, solemn eyes. On the other, a tiny, intricate engraving of a bird, a sparrow perhaps. The lock of hair, still tied with its faded blue ribbon, felt unnervingly soft. Who were these people? What was their story? And why were their relics hidden away in the coldest, most unsettling corner of Oak Haven Library? The CCTV monitors, once my passive eyes on the library, now seemed to offer glimpses into a world just beyond my own. Shadows danced in empty rooms with an alarming frequency. One monitor, focused on the main staircase, repeatedly showed a dark shape flitting up the stairs, always too quick to identify, always when I wasn't looking directly at that particular screen. I'd rewind, watch it again, the grainy image offering no clear answers, only deepening the sense of unease. The static that had once afflicted the archive camera began to appear on other monitors, brief bursts of white noise that felt like interruptions, or perhaps attempts at interference. My interactions with Mrs. Gable became strained. She was a perceptive woman, and my deteriorating state was becoming harder to conceal. "Arthur," she said one morning, her voice sharper than usual, "you look like you haven't slept in a week. Is everything all right on the night shift?" "No." "Problems?" I forced a reassuring smile, though it felt like a grimace. "No problems at all, Mrs. Gable. Just the usual creaks and groans of an old building. Perhaps I need to adjust my coffee intake." She didn't look convinced. Her eyes, magnified by her spectacles, searched mine. "This library has been here a long time, Arthur. It has history. Some of it not entirely pleasant, I imagine. But it's just a building. Bricks and mortar, books and paper. Her tone was firm, almost a warning. Was she trying to reassure me? Or herself? Or was she subtly acknowledging that she knew more than she let on? I couldn't tell. The true turning point, the incident that pushed me from terrified observer to active, desperate investigator, occurred on a still, moonless night. The silence in the library was absolute, so profound it felt like a physical weight. I was in the local history archive, the chill of the room seeping into my bones despite my jacket. I was drawn, against my better judgment, to the shelf where the wooden box was kept. As I reached for it, I heard a sound that made me freeze, a soft sigh, seemingly right behind me. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting a wild arc. The room was empty. The rows of ledgers and town records stood silent, coated in a thin layer of dust. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The only answer was another sigh, this time accompanied by a faint, almost inaudible whisper. It was so soft, so close to the edge of hearing, that I couldn't be sure if I'd imagined it. But the word, or what I thought was the word, sent a jolt of pure terror through me. Cold. It was the voice of a woman, old and frail, yet filled with an indescribable sadness. And it had come from the direction of the daguerreotype, or rather, from the space where the woman in the photograph would have been standing. I fled the archive room, my heart pounding like a trapped bird. Back in my office, I slumped into my chair, gasping for breath. This was no longer ignorable. This was direct. The presence, or at least one of them, had spoken. My mind raced. The woman in the photograph, the locket, the child's hair, the humming, the whispers. Were they connected? The library wasn't just haunted. It felt like it was trying to tell me something, to show me something. The silence on the dictionary page, the ask no questions underlined in the book, were these warnings or taunts? I spent the rest of that night poring over my logbook, looking for patterns, for connections I might have missed. The activity seemed to be concentrated in the older sections of the library, the archives, the pre-1900s fiction, the main reading room with its century-old clock. The children's section, too, was a frequent site of disturbances. As dawn approached, a desperate resolve began to form. I couldn't go on like this. The fear was consuming me, the lack of sleep eroding my sanity. I had to understand what was happening in Oak Haven Library. I had to find out who or what was sharing my nightly vigil. The alternative was to quit, to walk away, and let the library keep its secrets. But a part of me, a stubborn, perhaps foolish part, couldn't do that. I felt entangled, caught in the narrative of this place. When Mrs. Gable arrived, I looked at her with new eyes. How much did she know? Her family had been in Oak Haven for generations. Had she heard stories? Had other night guards experienced what I was going through. Her earlier words about the library's history echoed in my mind. Mrs. Gable, I began, my voice hoarse. About the library's history, has there ever been anything unusual reported here? Anything beyond the normal settling of an old building? She paused in the act of hanging up her coat, her back to me. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, slowly, she turned, her face unreadable. Every old place has its stories, Arthur, she said, her voice carefully neutral. Most of them are just that, stories. But her eyes told a different tale. There was a flicker of something there. Knowledge, perhaps even fear. I knew then that my quest for answers would have to go beyond my own experiences, beyond the confines of my nightly patrols. The library's secrets were buried deep, and I was determined to unearth them, whatever the cost. The entities in this place were no longer content with subtle hints. They were beginning to interact, and I had a dreadful feeling that their patience, like mine, was wearing thin. My conversation with Mrs. Gable, or rather her carefully worded deflection, did little to soothe the disquiet that had taken root in my soul. Instead, it solidified my resolve. Her eyes, for that fleeting moment, had betrayed a knowledge that her words denied. The library held secrets, and she was, if not a keeper of them, at least aware of their existence. My nights, once a solitary vigil against the mundane threats of burglary or vandalism, now transformed into a cautious, fearful investigation into the very fabric of the building's past. The entities, for I could no longer dismiss them as mere quirks or figments of my imagination, were no longer content with subtle hints. They had spoken, they had interacted, and I felt an urgent, pressing need to understand why and who they were. My first avenue of research was the library's own local history archive. The irony was not lost on me. The most haunted room in the building was also the one most likely to hold the answers I sought. Armed with my flashlight, my logbook, and a burgeoning sense of trepidation, I forced myself to spend more time within its chilled confines. The metallic, faintly sweet odor was ever present, seeming to coat my tongue and nostrils. The cold was a living thing, shifting and intensifying in unpredictable pockets. Each creak of the floorboards in the silence, each rustle of unseen paper, sent my nerves jangling. I started with the oldest town records, massive, leather-bound ledgers detailing births, deaths, and property transactions from the 19th and early 20th centuries. The script was often faded, the language archaic, and the sheer volume of information daunting. I was looking for anything unusual, any mention of the land upon which the library was built, any record of a tragedy that might correspond with the Victorian-era daguerreotype I had found. The stern-faced woman in the photograph became my focus. Her piercing gaze seemed to follow me even when the image was tucked away in its wooden box. I searched for names, for families who had lived in Oakhaven during that period, hoping for a match, a flicker of recognition. The library, or whatever resided within it, seemed to resent my intrusion into its past. The phenomena intensified, taking on a more personal, almost taunting quality. One night, as I pored over a brittle map of Oakhaven, dated 1888, the overhead light in the archive room, a single bare bulb, began to flicker erratically. It wasn't the gentle wavering of a failing filament. It was a deliberate, rhythmic pulsing, like a malevolent heartbeat. Then, with a soft pop, it extinguished, plunging the room into near total darkness, save for the weak beam of my flashlight. My heart leapt into my throat. I fumbled for my radio, my fingers suddenly clumsy. But before I could call for assistance or report a power issue, the light flickered back on, burning with a steady, almost defiant brightness. Another evening, while examining a collection of old town council meeting minutes, I heard the distinct sound of a book falling from a shelf in the adjacent aisle. I called out, my voice sharper than intended. No response. Cautiously, I investigated. A thick volume on local folklore lay splayed on the floor, pages crumpled. As I bent to pick it up, I noticed something that made my breath catch. A single word was circled on the open page, circled in what looked like a child's crayon. A vibrant, jarring red against the yellowed paper. Lost. The child. The humming. The marble. The crayon. The pieces were disparate, yet they felt connected, orbiting the central mystery of the woman in the photograph and the locket. Was the child hers? Was the lock of hair in the box from this lost child? The sadness I had felt when I first found the box deepened into a profound ache. My attempts to glean more information from Mrs. Gable were met with polite but firm resistance. "Arthur," she said one morning, her tone leaving no room for argument, "some things are best left undisturbed. This library is a place for the living, for the pursuit of knowledge, not for digging up old sorrows." Her words were a clear warning, yet they only fueled my conviction that she knew more. Old sorrows, the phrase resonated with the palpable sense of grief that seemed to cling to certain parts of the library. Frustrated by the slow pace of my archival research and the library's increasingly hostile reactions, I turned to another resource, the microfiche archives of Oakhaven's old newspaper, the Oakhaven Chronicle. The machine was located in a small windowless room off the main reference section. Hour after painstaking hour, I scrolled through grainy images of past events, searching for any mention of unusual deaths, unexplained disappearances, or tragedies connected to the library's location. or its early benefactors. It was during one of these late night sessions, the whir of the microfiche reader, the only sound in the oppressive silence, that the most direct and terrifying event occurred. I was examining an issue from October 1907, just before the library's construction began. An article detailed a local debate about the proposed site for the Carnegie gift. Suddenly, the temperature in the small room plummeted. I saw my breath mist in front of me. The hairs on my arms rose. Then I felt it, a distinct, icy touch on the back of my neck, like skeletal fingers brushing my skin. I gasped, spinning around in my chair, my flashlight clattering to the floor. The room was empty, but the sensation had been undeniably real. And then, a whisper, so close to my ear, I could almost feel the cold breath that accompanied it. Leave. It was the same frail, elderly woman's voice I had heard in the archive room, the voice that had uttered the word cold. But this time, it was not laden with sadness. It was infused with a chilling menace. Terror, stark and absolute, seized me. I scrambled for my flashlight, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grip it. I fled the microfiche room, not stopping until I reached the relative brightness of my office, my heart hammering against my ribs as if trying to escape my chest. The message was unequivocal. I was treading on dangerous ground. The entities were no longer just making their presence known, they were issuing threats. For a long moment, I considered Mrs. Gable's advice. Perhaps some things were best left undisturbed. The thought of quitting, of never again having to walk those shadowed halls, was incredibly tempting. But the image of the stern-faced woman, the lock of child's hair, the word lost, circled in red crayon, they wouldn't leave me. There was a story here, a tragedy that had been buried by time, and its echoes were still reverberating within these walls. And despite the fear, a part of me felt a strange sense of responsibility. The next night, I returned to the microfiche reader, my fear a cold knot in my stomach, but my determination hardened. I had to know. I scanned newspapers from the years leading up to the library's construction, looking for anything related to the land it was built upon. And then I found it, an article from the Oak Haven Chronicle, dated June 17th, 1898, almost a decade before the library was even conceived. The headline was small, tucked away on an inner page. Local woman and child perish in house fire. My blood turned to ice. I read on, my eyes devouring the faded print. The article described a devastating fire that had consumed a small farmhouse on the outskirts of Oak Haven, on the very plot of land where the library now stood. The victims were listed as Mrs. Eliza Willoughby and her 5-year-old daughter, Sarah. Mrs. Willoughby was described as a recluse, a widow who kept to herself. The cause of the fire was undetermined, though foul play was not suspected at the time. There was a grainy, indistinct photograph Accompanying the article, a sketch really of the smoldering ruins of a house. Eliza Willoughby, Sarah Willoughby stared at the names, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. The stern-faced woman in the daguerreotype, Eliza, the lock of child's hair, the humming, Sarah, the cold, the whispers, the profound sadness that permeated the library, their lingering spirits, trapped in the place where their lives had been so tragically cut short. The locket, with its tiny sparrow engraving, perhaps a cherished possession of Eliza's, or a gift for Sarah. As I sat there, the weight of this discovery pressing down on me, the microfiche reader suddenly whirred and clicked, the screen going blank. I tried to advance the film, but it was stuck. Then, slowly, an image began to form on the screen, not from the newspaper roll, but something else, something superimposed. It was a face, the face of the woman from the daguerreotype, Eliza Willoughby. Her eyes, dark and filled with an unimaginable sorrow, stared directly at me from the screen. Her lips, pale and cracked, moved. No sound came from the machine, but I heard her voice in my mind, as clear as if she were standing beside me, a whisper of ice and despair that pierced through the silence of the library and into the very core of my being. She is still lost. Find her. Then the image faded and the screen went dark, leaving me in the suffocating silence of the small room, the echo of her plea reverberating in the sudden, chilling emptiness. My investigation had yielded an answer, but it had also delivered a charge, a desperate entreaty from beyond the grave. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that my nights at the Oakhaven Town Library were about to become infinitely more terrifying.